The federal government is facing some pushback from a political ally. The Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador says he's going to take the government to court over equalization payments, claiming the program's formula is fundamentally broken. That court challenge has recently gained the support of another typically friendly Premier.
I will be asking our Attorney General to work with Andrew's team to have a look at the case they're bringing forward and see if there's a place for British Columbia in this, because it's critically important to me that British Columbia is treated fairly.
The equalization program is one of the major financial transfer programs from the federal government to provinces. Andrew Furey is the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, and he joins me now. Premier, welcome back to the show.
Hi, David. How are you?
I'm very good, sir. I wonder if you explain to me the timing of this. You haven't filed your constitutional challenge in court yet, but you're getting ready to launch it. Why now? What is so specific about this point in time?
Well, David, we've been having conversations with the federal government with respect to equalization for some time now. Since taking office, it's been a point of discussion for me. It's been well documented by my Minister of Finance and frankly, in discussions that I've had formally and informally with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. And we've come to a point where we don't think that we've made any progress in changing how they view, or how the federal government more broadly views equalization. So we thought that now was the time to heighten the level of discussion and awareness, frankly, across jurisdictions of the inequities that exist within the equalization formula and how it's not as it was intended to be. The spirit is not being reflected in the application of the formula as enshrined in the Constitution. So we thought that now was the time to take that discussion across the country, make sure that people are aware of the inequities that exist in terms of, and the incongruity that exists with the application and the calculations within the formula itself.
You say it's not acting as enshrined in the Constitution. The Constitution only says you have to have equalization. It doesn't say how it has to be constituted necessarily. That's always been a policy decision by the federal government, right?
Sure. Yeah, but it does say reasonably comparable level of services for reasonably comparable level of taxation. The way that it's applied right now is there's contemplation for the revenue streams and the taxation streams, but no contemplation whatsoever for the delivery of services. And if you look at a province like Newfoundland and Labrador, I don't need to tell you, we're 3 times the landmass of the maritime provinces combined, with about a quarter of the population, with significant demographic density and geographic and historic challenges. That means that the cost to deliver services is very different for Newfoundland and Labrador, and I would argue different for other provinces, especially with some rural and remote northern communities.
But why is this not a political argument as opposed to a constitutional and legal argument? I mean, a constitutional challenge will take a long time and probably shut down political conversations on this particular issue.
Well, I disagree. Actually, I think that you can have both a political conversation and a constitutional conversation and a legal conversation at the same time, frankly. There is, we believe, an unfairness in the way that the spirit of Section 36 is being applied across the country right now. And it's not fair. If you look at, even if you take a small section of time, 2010 to 2023, and look at the quantums of money that have been distributed across the country, in that period of time, as you know, Newfoundland and Labrador has received $0 in equalization. Meanwhile, the maritime provinces combined, not to pick on them particularly because it's not their fault, have received over $50 billion. Quebec, combined with the Maritimes, has received over $200 billion. Newfoundland and Labrador has received none. So it's my job as Premier of the province to make sure that Newfoundland and Labrador is being treated fairly, and I don't think fairness is being reflected in the application of the formula right now.
So bottom line is, I mean, it's revenue that pushes you out, right? It's oil money and other resource money that comes in. That has largely pushed you out of the formula. But you're saying it's the expense side that's not being calculated fairly, and that would put you back in the formula if they took into consideration the specific cost challenges of service delivery in a heavily rural province.
Well, our argument is twofold. First, it's with respect to the contemplation of services. That's one, in the spirit of which that is reflected in the Constitution. The second is the formula itself, and there are some incongruencies and some issues with the calculation of the formula, including By the way, the fiscal capacity cap, which was introduced by Prime Minister Harper in 2008, so this is across administrations. It's not particularly partisan politics at all. This is just how it's being applied. That fiscal capacity cap systematically impacts Newfoundland and Labrador and Saskatchewan differently than all other provinces. It's not fair, and it needs to be reevaluated. There's no contemplation for incentivizing development of natural resources. Canada is a natural resource-driven economy. It always will be and should be. We have beautiful natural resources that we need to develop. That comes with a cost, including starting new industries, the regulatory regime, to bring people together, to start new industries, like in this time of transition, windmills and hydrogen. That comes with a cost. There's no contemplation to that in the establishment of the calculations either. So our argument is twofold. It's first of all on the spirit of and the intent of fairness in the Constitution. The second is in the calculation and how natural resources are handled by the federal government. And I believe that there's proxies for both.
You said it's not a partisan fight. Well, you're a Liberal premier launching a constitutional challenge against a Liberal-led federal government. But, you know, your opponents provincially, you know, I heard Tony Wakeham, the PC leader, calling it a frantic bid to distance yourself from Justin Trudeau, coming on the heels of a by-election you lost by 60 points. And everybody back home tells me Justin Trudeau's unpopularity hurt you in that seat.
Look, this is a conversation that we've been having some time with the federal government. It's well documented in letters back and forth. It's conversations that I've had with the Prime Minister. And it has nothing to do with trying to separate ourselves from the federal government. It has to do with standing up for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and doing what's right and doing what's fair and doing what was intended when the people who signed the Constitution in 1982 felt like this was being enshrined.
But, you know, it was a seat you lost by 60 percentage points, and you held it.
By-election. People lose by-elections all the time. They take out their frustrations. We appreciate that. We want to make sure we're listening to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and regain their trust. You're trying to establish a timeline between a by-election loss and a constitutional challenge and equalization issue that has existed for decades in Newfoundland and Labrador. While I can appreciate trying to tie that knot, I struggle to see the actual connection.
No, I was trying to shift to ask if it was, in fact, as the PCs in Newfoundland tell me, that it is a Justin Trudeau thing that hurt you in that vote, that it is an anti-Prime Minister sentiment that hurt you as the provincial Liberal in that by-election.
Sure. I mean, we have heard, and I mean, the polls display that certainly there is some questioning right now of the Prime Minister in Atlantic Canada. There is no question about that. And certainly that's a message that we heard at the doors as well. But my job is purely fixed on doing what's right for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. The Prime Minister has his job. I'm not going to comment on that. My job is to look after Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and to ensure that they get what's right and just and fair, and is reflected in the 1982 Constitution.
So you've been building a coalition of other premiers on this, right? You were in Vancouver recently to meet with David Eby, who has an election later this year and is also expressing frustration with the federal government. And he says he's going to look at intervener status in this case. Tim Houston, who else? Blaine Higgs? Who are the other premiers lining up to sign on to this?
Well, I mean, we've had good conversations with Premier Eby, of course. It was a revelation to him that Newfoundland and Labrador didn't get equalization. I think he was somewhat shocked when you saw the volumes of money that were being transferred that BC doesn't have access to either. We've had good conversations with Alberta and Saskatchewan. I know that Premier Houston has expressed some concern with respect to equalization and how it may disincentivize natural resource development. And we've had a very broad, high-level conversation with Premier Higgs in the past on it. But it will, and I can tell you, Premier Ford was supportive last summer of realizing that his province received equalization and Newfoundland and Labrador did not. So it all speaks to me. It's all evidence to me that the formula is broken, and not saying that it needs to be thrown out. I'm not saying that it's the fault of this particular administration. I'm saying it's time for a review. It's time to look at what's right, just, and fair, and it hasn't been done. A review of the equalization formula has not been done in a fulsome way since the early 2000s.
So just as a final point, Premier, what response have you had from this administration, from the federal government, since announcing the constitutional challenge? Have you heard, I know you and the Prime Minister went to Normandy together. Were there any conversations on this? Have you heard anything from Chrystia Freeland?
Sure. I think there's a broad acceptance that, that this is a discussion that needs to be furthered. We didn't get into any specific details of how or when or if that would occur. I just expressed my view on both how the formula is calculated and how it's reflected in the Constitution and how it's not working for Newfoundland and Labrador right now. And that's, I articulated our position, and I look forward to hearing theirs.
So is it possible the constitutional challenge can be avoided entirely if they're open to having a further conversation? What are your thoughts?
I would certainly welcome that. You know, I do think, as you suggested at the outset, not only is this a constitutional argument, it is also equivalent a political argument and one that could be diplomatically resolved without use of the courts.
Andrew Furey, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, always appreciate the time, sir. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, David.